Good morning, guys. How's everybody doing? So today I'm going to show you guys how to do something I've been asked a lot about, and that's about the cylindrical molds that I use for pouring epoxy casts, things like handles or duct calls or a handful of different things. Now you can make these with normal mold materials, and you can make them square. That's fine. I just don't care for trying to knock the corners off of a square epoxy cast mold just because it tends to shatter a little bit, things like that. So I have found that making the mold cylindrical not only cuts down on a little bit of waste, in my opinion, but it also makes the turning much easier and seems to go a little faster. And you come out with molds about like this. This is a green and I believe spalted gumwood duct call cast that I have done, a blank that I have done, and it used the same exact technique that I'm going to show you guys today. The only difference is I used PVC pipe, which I normally use, instead of the clear little tube that I'm going to use today. Now I'm using a clear tube just so that I can show you guys how everything lays out and how the pour looks going in. And especially if you're using a pressure tank or anything like that, how you really won't have a problem with air pockets or anything like that. And the molds seem to work really well. I've been asked a lot about them, so I figured I would do a quick little video and show you guys how I make them, and I hope you guys enjoy it. Let's get at it. Step one in making your cylindrical mold is to cut your cylinders to length for whatever blanks you're needing. Now, I would very much suggest figuring out what length you would like your blank to be, and then adding anywhere from a half to a full inch to allow you to actually do the epoxy pour, and you don't want it spilling over the tops of the mold. Step two is to split the cylindrical mold down the center. This will allow you to have two halves to actually be able to take it apart and make removing the blank much easier. Now for this I use the bandsaw. You can use a hacksaw or whatever you have available to make straight cuts down the center of the tubing. Just the bandsaw was the easiest for me. Step three in preparing your cylindrical mold is to deburr all of the edges. Now this is super important, especially on the side edges where you'll actually be touching the molds back together and gluing them in place, and also on the bottom where you will be gluing it down to the base. This allows for a nice tight seal and ensures for no epoxy leaking out after you glue it up. Step four is going to be to put packing tape onto whatever you're using as a base. I suggest melamine or Lexan or some other type of plastic. That to me has worked out really well in the past. And using packing tape will ensure that when you remove it from the base, it just comes right off and doesn't actually stick to whatever material you're using as a base for your mold. Step five is to layer packing tape actually onto the sides of the cylinder halves that we have already prepared. Now again, what this does is allows the epoxy to cleanly release from the side of the mold. And when I go to demold this, you'll actually see how much this packing tape really helps. It makes things super easy to demold. Step six is to hot glue everything up. And now with this, I really suggest putting a bead of hot glue down each of the edges of the cylinder molds or the halves that we have made, and then actually combining the halves back together with glue in between. Now, with this being said, some glue will get onto the inside of the mold, and there's not a whole lot you can do about that. I always suggest using a little larger mold than what you absolutely have to have for your final blank size. But doing this really does help to ensure that you're not going to have any epoxy leaks after everything is finally sealed up. And then also, after you get these put together, give them a second to dry and set so that the hot glue kind of hardens up between the layers of plastic. Then add a really thick layer of hot glue to each seam. Now, when doing this, don't be afraid to use a good bit of glue. It's always better to have more than what you need on this, as it will help not leak. And if you use too little, there is a likelihood that you will get small leaks. And if you apply pressure inside the pressure pot, that small leak could become a much larger leak also. Step 7 is to secure the outsides of the mold. I use zip ties for this. This actually makes the seam stronger so you have less likelihood of leaks, and also just secures the mold shape a little better. Just a few zip ties around the outside and it's all done. Step 8 is to apply hot glue to the bottom of the mold and actually secure it to the base that you're going to use. Now in this case, I'm using a melamine board with the packing tape as I showed earlier, and I put a bead of hot glue around the bottom of the mold. After doing that, you apply pressure to the top of the mold so that the hot glue is actually nice and tightly sealed against the base, and then liberally apply glue all the way around the seam. Now you cannot really have too much glue in this, as you want to make sure that no epoxy is going to leak out, and this is one of the most likely spots of that. Also, that if you don't have enough hot glue there, the mold can move around or shift, and that would cause leaks as well. So feel free to put what might even feel like a little too much hot glue onto the base and the seam of the mold in the base. So for this project, I am actually going to be doing 2 pours at once. So I was using the same base just to save on materials and time. So I just followed the same steps up to this point for the second mold using the same base. Step 9 is to fill your molds and then pour the epoxy. Now I'm using cherry wood. Whatever you are using that is not epoxy in the mold should always be put in first, and then you actually mix your epoxy at that point. You do not want the epoxy starting its curing process before you're able to get to the pour. Now, another thing that I find super important to point out is that with these molds, as you pour, the epoxy goes to the bottom and then fills up from the bottom up. This will help to push out most of the air and help with reducing voids and air pockets. But if you want a perfect casting with no air pockets, make sure to use a pressure tank. Last but not least is step 10, which is to demold the blank after you take it out of the pressure tank and remove the hot glue. Alright guys, so that turned out great. This is actually the copper pour that you saw me demold. Now, as you can see, it might be a little hard to see here. The plastic works fine. A mold like that, cylindrical mold, is super easy to use. And if you put packing tape on the inside of the mold like I did, this thing just pops right out. It gives you no problems coming out. And this process is the exact same using a PVC pipe, which I prefer to do. I did this with these clear tubes just because I wanted to let you guys see into the mold to actually see how the molds work and how well they do as far as you do the pour, it pushing air out the top and things like that. Now, I do put these in a pressure tank and let them pressure cure, and that also removes all the air out of them, and they turn out great. I am super excited about this one. This is going to be a beautiful call. That being said, it did these right here. If you can see, these three pieces here did drift up a little bit. Now, when I do a PVC mold, I usually take the slivers of whatever specific wood type I'm using, because I'm going for a random pattern, and force them in there nice and tight, and that stops them from drifting up. With this, because I was using these thin-walled clear plastic tubes, then I couldn't really do that, because if I did that too much, it could possibly hurt the seam, and you'd have a leak, and that's the last thing you want. Or it would distort the shape of the mold. Don't want that either. So I just kind of didn't shove as much wood down into the mold and force everything in there. So these drifted up a little bit. On the other one, the black and copper, I actually had the same problem, but I put even fewer pieces in it. And I actually put a piece of Lexan on top of the mold and just kind of taped it down. It worked fine. Now, I will say this is mainly for wood turning projects, or for the turning projects, I guess you should say. But I am going to make some of these a little larger to auction off or sell on my Instagram. These things are beautiful. They really are. These colors and stuff, and you wind up with this amazing random pattern, and it's just, I love it. People seem to really love them, especially when you use good wood and good colors. Anything spalted or anything with a lot of grain actually shows up really well in a pattern like this. But anyway, guys, I hope you guys enjoyed it. Make sure you subscribe, and also go check out my Instagram at jpaynewoodworking, and follow my Facebook page. I actually got the Facebook page up now at jpaynewoodworking. And like I said before in a different video, I am working on getting the website up, and as soon as that's up, these, like certain blanks, I'll have colored blanks for different types of woods and stuff. You will be able to order them if you would just like to order them and try them out. But again, I hope this video answered some questions for you guys, and I hope you enjoyed it and learned something. So we'll see you guys in the next video. Later.